Hey everybody, welcome to our new unit, Aquatic and Terrestrial Pollution. To begin with today, we'll be focusing on types of pollution, specifically what are the sources, how are humans impacting ecosystems as a result of this pollution, and categories of pollutants themselves. So starting off, pollution, what is it? A good working definition is contamination of air, water, or soil by harmful substances. Usually these are foreign substances introduced to the environment by humans. We do have natural pollutant examples, so something like a volcano can release sulfur dioxide similar to burning coal, but obviously a volcano is a natural process. So we have this natural category and anthropogenic or human-caused category of pollutants as well. So obviously we focus on the human-caused ones because those are the preventable types of pollutants. So pollution by source, we have two categories, point source and non-point source pollution. A point source type of pollution is one in which it's identifiable from a single source, so something like a waste drain pipe, a discharge pipe, or smokestack could be in the point source pollution category. These are obviously easier to manage because we know the direct source from which it came. Non-point source pollutants tend to be kind of diffuse and it can be very difficult to track down. So it's like if we spray pesticide on a farm, and it runs off, or we have runoff from a city down into a storm drain. It's kind of difficult to trace back to a single identifiable source, so it definitely makes it more challenging to manage. We have these four main kind of categories of pollutants. The industrial category, agricultural, domestic, and then fossil fuels. So essentially things that are more industrial tend to be things like heavy metals, thermal pollution like heat, additional kind of chemicals and acids. So our acid mine drainage example is a good one. Mercury is another as a heavy metal example. Things like cadmium, chromium, those kind of things. Agricultural waste, we've talked a lot about already. Fertilizers, animal waste, and pesticides, usually from runoff getting into waterways. Domestic waste we'll get into. Food, sewage, and garbage tend to be in those categories. And things we're very responsible as individuals for creating. So how do we manage those? And fossil fuels, the release of greenhouse gases specifically, but other gases that can cause respiratory problems, different types of secondary pollutants, and acid rain. So how does humans pollution impact our ecosystems, our environment? Well, I got three categories set up for us in notes here. One is biodiversity. So ultimately, organisms have this range of tolerance that we talked about way at the beginning of the year. There's this comfortable area where they can thrive, and forcing them into the extremes of those comfortable areas and into more discomfort can affect their ability to maintain homeostasis, to thrive and survive and reproduce. So the more we cause stress and death, the worse they'll be in terms of survival. So pollution can force organisms to those extremes and cause those issues. Something as simple as litter or plastic pollution can cause intestinal blockages. So we can see the seabirds tend to eat things floating on the surface of the water. So this is an example of the gut contents of an albatross here, and just the intestinal blockages that would kill this animal as a result of eating this plastic pollutant. Another thing might be something as simple as sediments. So sediments that are disturbed maybe from a construction site, right? And those sediments run off into waterways, or maybe something from mining. And ultimately, the sediments can block the sunlight that gets to our aquatic ecosystems, making it more cloudy and murky, and that can greatly reduce primary productivity, the ability of our plants to do photosynthesis. Aquatic ecosystems in particular are vulnerable to a lot of pollutants, given that when pollutants get into these aquatic ecosystems, these organisms that live there are literally surrounded by the pollutant 24/7 and suffer this chronic exposure. So something like coral reefs can be harmed, as we discussed earlier in the year about ocean temperatures, right? And warming temperatures can lead to coral bleaching, causes stress within the coral and the symbiotic algae, bale, and cause this bleaching effect, which eventually leads to the death of these coral. Sediments can do the same thing by preventing sunlight from getting to them, and the fishing practices, things like bottom trawling in particular, can damage coral structures. Oil spills, particularly dangerous when we talk about marine organisms, because the oil hydrocarbons obviously are in the oil, and they're going to float on the surface of the water and coat the feathers of these marine mammals and birds, and can affect their ability to survive and reproduce as well. And some components do sink to the ocean floor and can cause issues with organisms that dwell on the bottom. So really, there's no group of organisms that win from an oil spill here. Oceanic dead zones from fertilizer runoff, the process of eutrophication in particular, will be discussed later in this unit. Specific kind of coastal marine habitats like mangroves or even wetlands are vulnerable to pollution. Runoff tends to accumulate in those areas and affects the organisms there as well. And then something like industrial heavy metal contamination can get into the groundwater as a result, a lot of times, of mercury from coal burning. But also, once it gets into our aquatic ecosystems, bacteria convert this to this very toxic methylmercury component, which bioaccumulates, and we'll discuss that later. So the final third category here is human impacts on ecosystems, and in terms of the quality of life and health of us as individuals here. So what are some ways that these pollutants and activities can affect us? Oil spills certainly have an economic impact on tourism and fishing. Makes it a little difficult to travel to these areas or want to travel to these areas when the beach looks like what it does in the background there. Also, human health. Children in particular can be born with risk of neurological defects from contamination of mercury into fish, or even in the mother's diet as well. So there's a lot of issues that can happen with health from chronic exposure, and particularly developing fetus and health of a mother are of key concern, but also chronic exposure throughout an entire lifespan can be reasons for concern when we're exposed to pollution. So you can see all the different things from water pollution, soil, and air that can impact us in a negative way. Finally, we look at these specific categories of pollutants. Now, our AP criteria talks specifically about endocrine disruptors as the focus of concern, but there are other classes of toxins as well that we will discuss in this class. So we'll start with endocrine disruptors. It's probably the priority here. These are chemicals that can interfere with the endocrine system of animals, and specifically the functioning of hormones in animals. So there's a picture of thyroid here. Produces very important hormones in the human body and can be disrupted in a significant way and affect a lot of functions if it's not working properly. So an endocrine disruptor would be a big issue for humans and thyroid function. We also have other organisms that can be affected by endocrine disruptors too. It still causes things like birth defects and other developmental disorders. In particular, fish species and some other like amphibian species tend to be have gender imbalances as they're exposed to endocrine disruptors over their lifespan, so that can cause issues. We have neurotoxins, which can impact functioning of our nervous system, so the brain in particular. Allergens impacting our immune system, and teratogens are specifically focused on impacting embryonic development of organisms. And then we have our carcinogen group, which we're probably most familiar with. These are components or toxins that can cause cancer, are linked to cancer. Our last type of pollutant or chemical classification would be a persistent organic pollutant, or a POP, POPs for short. These are chemicals that really don't break down very quickly in the environment. Really, in order for them to be classified as a POP, they're synthetic man-made compounds. These are things that are oftentimes found in things like insecticides, like DDT, or plastics, like PCBs. These components that are man-made and then are released into the environment, they oftentimes have a long lifespan in our sediments, in our water, in our soil. When organisms are exposed to these, oftentimes these chemicals are stored in their fatty tissues, and over a lifetime of exposure can accumulate to a significant degree. Over their lifetime, they also can excrete and release these chemicals from
their fat tissues, and it can affect the functions, the biological functions in the rest of their body. These can also travel long distances and again remain for a very long period of time.